Here is another video in our playlist series for building a stairway between two decks. And in this video, I will provide you with an example for dealing with decks that might not be perfectly square or parallel to each other. And in reality, this is just another method you can use to double check the length of your stair stringers to make sure that they are going to fit between the two decks if the stair stringer is not going to be sitting on top of the lower deck. So the first thing I want you to do is lay out your stair stringer and then measure from one of the points. And in this example here, we're going to measure from this point to this point. And we're not going to cut anything. We're just going to measure from these selected points. You can select other points, and I'll show you an example of that here in a little bit. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're actually going to be measuring in between the decks. And that will be this point to this point here. And to get these points, you're going to need to actually figure out where the stair stringers are going to be located and mark the location for those stringers at the bottom and the top. Another measurement that might be more helpful would be to go from this point here, or the same one in our first example, and then change the location to the top here, where the top of the lower section of the stringer is even with the top of the deck framing, and then measure that area. So again, the top of the deck framing, and of course the other measurement here is going to be the same as our previous example. And like I said, you can select other measurement points if you want to. And again, here is the line that we will be measuring on the stringer. Next up, let's go ahead and pretend like the measurement between the decks was a little longer than the one we had on our stringer layout. And if that's the case, you can either add to the top or add to the bottom. And to do that, you're just simply going to measure from one of the points and then try and create a straight line that will intersect with this line here so that you can make this part a little bit longer. Let's go ahead and zoom in here. So let's pretend like we needed to add an inch to our stair stringer to prevent it from being too short. And we're just simply going to make a mark here and then square off of this area. And in this situation here, you might need to lower this line here. You don't really want much of the bottom part of the stair stringer sticking too far out of the hanger. So that means you might need to lower this line here to reduce the length of this line here. And if any part of this doesn't make sense, feel free to share that part. Any questions you have, leave them in the comment area, because if you have them, others might also. Next up, let's go ahead and pretend like the measurement that we took is a little shorter between the decks, and we need to reduce the length of the stair stringer. And again, we can measure from this point here to somewhere over here to reduce the length, or we can measure from this point here to the top to reduce the length of the stair stringer. And again, I hope I didn't lose anybody there. We're just simply reversing it, starting at the bottom instead of the top. And then you're simply going to square off of this line. Grab your framing square and then line one side of the framing square up with this part here or this line here. And then have it intersect with this point here and then square off of that. And then lay out for your hanger if you're going to use a hanger. And then after you have that section laid out, you can double check this measurement. And if everything looks good, you can go ahead and cut the bottom and not the top. We're going to actually sit the bottom of the stringer on top of either a hanger or a block of wood like we have here. So just a scrap piece of wood attached to your ledger if it's going to work out. Sometimes the bottom of this might extend past the bottom of your framing joist. And if that's the case, you might need to use a hanger. So not too difficult. You can see what we're doing here. We're lining this line up here with the top of the joist, and then we are going to check the top. Now, if you remember, I reduced the length of this right here, even though I didn't move the decks, to provide you with your first problem and provide you with an example of why we don't want to cut this until we've checked it. So if you have a situation like this where you're not going to be too far away from the position of the stringer, then you can simply mark this and cut it. And then after you've cut this line here, you don't need to cut the rest of this. You can set the stringer in its original location or where it's going to be located and then see if it fits. And if it's either too tight or too loose, you will be able to remove some material off of it or add some material to the next stringer. So again, if I'm a 1/2 inch off, I can go ahead and add a 1/2 inch to either the top or the bottom when I'm laying out my next stringer. And this would be a good time to check to make sure that all of these lines are level for your treads or your steps. And again, this situation right here will only work if the stringers aren't going to be located very far, maybe within a foot. So if you do put this up there and it's off a little bit, then I would try to cut it a little longer than your measurement and then set the stringer in place and double check it. Just don't mark it at this end and then cut the stair stringer if it's off a little bit from the measurement you took. Because if these two decks are not parallel and perfectly level, then you could have a problem. And then once you have the length of the stringer determined and it fits perfectly in between the decks, then you can go ahead and cut out the steps because you're going to use this as a pattern for the next stringers. So for some, the next step might be obvious, but just in case it isn't, we're going to take our pattern stringer and relocate it. We're going to use the pattern to double check all of the stringer locations, because if the stringer needs to be trimmed or extended, then this tells you that your decks are not perfectly parallel. Or if they are perfectly parallel, they are not perfectly level. So if the stringer is a little short, you can add some material to the bottom or the top of the stringer. And I will be making another video on that to try and help you with which part of the stringer you're going to try and add the material or subtract it from without creating too much of a problem for the stairway being out of square. And of course, I will put that video on our playlist when it is completed. Until then, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment area. And don't forget to watch the other videos in this particular series if you're going to be dealing with a situation like this, or building a set of stairs between two different levels for your outdoor deck.